Before I move forward, we are counting on you to support our channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing documentaries to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now let us walk together into a story that begins on the Iberian Peninsula, in a time when religions and cultures lived side by side. The pace of our narrative is gentle and deliberate, designed to help you rest as you listen. The Iberian world before the tribunal was not homogeneous. In the centuries before the late 15th century, Christian kingdoms coexisted with Muslim emirates and Jewish communities. Markets bustled with merchants speaking different tongues. The call to prayer and church bells could be heard in the same day. In this multicultural setting, communities shared bread, songs, and festivals, though tensions were never far away. The Reconquista, a long campaign by Christian rulers to reclaim territories held by Muslim states, gradually changed the political landscape. Cities like Toledo and Córdoba were once centers of learning where scholars translated texts between Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin. Artisans crafted intricate metalwork and textiles, and poets wrote verses about love and faith. As Christian forces took more cities, laws and social expectations shifted. Different faiths had to adapt to new rulers, and trust between neighbors sometimes frayed. To appreciate this cultural mosaic, imagine walking through a medieval street in Córdoba. You see a mosque with its distinctive arches and calligraphy. Nearby, a synagogue stands with a wooden door carved with Hebrew inscriptions. Further along, a church towers above the rooftops, its bell tower marking the hours. People of different backgrounds trade fabrics, spices, and stories. A Muslim scholar discusses medicine with a Jewish physician, while a Christian monk copies ancient Greek texts. Food stalls offer flatbreads, olives, and sweet pastries flavored with honey. The air is fragrant with incense and the scent of roasting lamb. Children play in the alleys, their laughter echoing off stone walls. This environment fostered creativity and exchange, but it was also precarious. Political shifts could quickly turn neighbors into outsiders. By the late 14th century, a wave of violence against Jewish communities erupted in various towns. In 1391, anti-Jewish riots occurred in several cities, and many Jews either fled, were killed, or chose conversion to Christianity. Those who converted were known as conversos. Publicly, they joined the Catholic Church, but some maintained aspects of Jewish life in private, while others fully embraced their new faith. Suspicion brewed around them. Were they truly sincere? Did they practice rituals secretly? Neighbors whispered and looked for signs. A house without smoke on a Saturday, or unusual foods before a festival. At the same time, local politics and envy often motivated accusations. We can imagine how unsettling it must have been to live in a community where your religious sincerity could be questioned at any moment. Conversos occupied a wide range of professions. Some were merchants who dealt in wool, spices, or precious metals. Others were doctors, lawyers, or artisans. Their skills were valuable to the economy. They spoke multiple languages and had connections across the Mediterranean. This network allowed them to import fine cloth from Italy, silver from North Africa, and ideas from scholars in distant lands. Yet their success made them targets for those resentful of wealth and influence. Rumors about secret Sabbath meals or hidden Torah scrolls fueled distrust. To protect themselves, some conversos tried to display overt piety by attending Mass regularly and donating to churches. Others withdrew from public life, creating close-knit communities where they could preserve cultural traditions. The tension between public conformity and private identity created deep stress and vulnerability. This atmosphere set the stage for Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. They were determined to unify their kingdoms under one crown and one faith. After successfully conquering Granada in 1492, the last Muslim emirate on the peninsula, They turned their attention toward internal unity. They requested permission from Pope Sixtus IV to establish an institution that would investigate heresy. In 1478, the papal bull granted this authority, marking the beginning of what would be known as the Spanish Inquisition. The stated purpose was to identify and correct deviations from Catholic doctrine, but political and economic motives were intertwined. By targeting conversos, the crown could also weaken a group that held positions in commerce and administration, while confiscating their property added to royal coffers. The tribunal also served as a tool to assert the monarch's control over religious affairs. The decision to establish the tribunal must be understood in light of the broader history of church inquisitions. Earlier inquisitions existed in France and Italy during the medieval period, tasked with combating heretical movements like the Cathars and Waldensians. These institutions were subordinate to the papacy and operated under strict canonical procedures. The Spanish variant was unusual because the monarchy had significant control over appointments and policies. The monarchs used the institution as an extension of royal authority. They saw it as a way to consolidate power in newly united territories and to reduce the influence of local nobles. The tribunal thus functioned as both a religious and a political instrument, weaving the two spheres tightly together. To understand the workings of this institution, we need to look at its organization. At the top was the Suprema, or Supreme Council of the Inquisition. This body, composed of several members and presided over by the Inquisitor General, directed policy and oversaw regional tribunals. The Inquisitor General was nominated by the Crown and approved by the Pope. Tomás de Torquemada, appointed in 1483, became the most famous Inquisitor General. He had a stern demeanor and a vision of religious purity. Under his leadership, the system became more structured. Local tribunals were established in major cities. Each tribunal included inquisitors, fiscal prosecutors, notaries, assessors, constables, and jailers. Inquisitors were often trained in law and theology. The fiscal prosecutor gathered accusations, examined witnesses, and prepared cases. Notaries recorded testimonies with meticulous care. Constables arrested suspects and maintained order. The administrative machinery was extensive, reflecting the institution's ambition to reach every corner of society. Torquemada himself came from a Dominican background. He served as confessor to Queen Isabella, influencing her spiritual perspective. He was deeply committed to the ideals of purity and orthodoxy. Under his guidance, 28 articles were drafted to define offenses beyond simple heresy, including practices such as sodomy, blasphemy, and sorcery. The articles also allowed for the use of torture to obtain evidence, albeit with restrictions. His tenure was marked by a high number of trials and executions. Historians estimate that about 2,000 people were executed during his time as Inquisitor General. He also played a role in persuading the monarchs to issue the Edict of Expulsion against the Jews in 1492, which forced approximately 40,000 Jews to leave Spain. The combination of doctrinal zeal and political calculation defined his approach. One of the first public notices posted by the tribunal was known as the Edict of Grace. When inquisitors arrived in a town, they would have the edict read aloud in churches and public squares. It invited anyone guilty of heresy to come forward voluntarily within a set period, often 30 or 40 days. Those who confessed would receive lighter penances and might even remain anonymous. The idea was to encourage people to denounce themselves and others. Over time, this approach shifted. Edicts of grace gave way to edicts of faith. These later edicts listed in meticulous detail the beliefs and behaviors considered heretical, from observing Jewish or Islamic rituals to engaging in prohibited mystical practices. They were posted on church doors and read during Lent. By listing every possible deviation, the edicts made nearly everyone suspect in some way. People listened in dread, aware that any neighbor might denounce them. The reading of these edicts was an event in itself. Church doors were crowded with villagers and townsfolk who had come to hear the announcement. Priests, standing on raised platforms, slowly recited every line of the text. The language was formal and precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. Mothers held their children's hands tightly. Men removed their hats out of respect. People listened for mentions of activities that might reflect on themselves or their households. For many, it was a moment of fear and introspection. The edict served as both a warning and a tool for social control. At the end of the reading, a period of silence followed, and then people dispersed, whispering and speculating. The psychological impact of such public declarations cannot be overstated. It reminded everyone that they were under scrutiny. Accusations could come from many sources: a disgruntled neighbor, a former business partner, someone with a personal grudge, or a genuinely pious informant. They were often delivered secretly to the inquisitors. Once a person was denounced, the tribunal would collect evidence. Witnesses were questioned, though the accused were not informed of who had spoken against them. When enough evidence was gathered, a warrant was issued, and the person was arrested. Detention was a shock. Prisoners were taken to the tribunal's jail, which was separate from ordinary prisons and maintained by the inquisitors. Surprisingly, these prisons were known for being relatively clean and orderly for the time. Records show that the cost of food, clothing, and even medicine for inmates was carefully documented. Wealthy prisoners paid their own expenses. Those without means had their costs covered by the tribunal. This level of record-keeping reflects the bureaucratic nature of the institution. Upon arrest, personal belongings were inventoried and confiscated. Land, livestock, jewelry, and even kitchen utensils were listed meticulously. The accused's family might find themselves destitute overnight. Confiscated goods were sold, and proceeds went to the tribunal's coffers. This economic dimension added a layer of hardship for the families left behind. They might rely on relatives or charity to survive. In some cases, entire households left town, unable to bear the stigma and financial ruin. The confiscation also served as a warning to others. Heresy had material consequences. During detention, the prisoner had time for reflection and anxiety. They were often kept in solitary confinement, with no knowledge of the specific charges. They could provide a list of enemies to the court to discount testimonies from those known to bear a grudge, but they had no legal representation. The absence of counsel made the situation deeply uneven. The prisoner's statements were recorded and compared with other testimonies. The tribunal's goal was to achieve a confession, ideally voluntary, so that the accused could be reconciled to the church. Confession was considered proof of repentance and allowed for penance rather than harsher punishment. Interrogations were methodical. Inquisitors asked about the accused's beliefs, practices, and associations. They compared statements to find contradictions. Torture, though infamous in later imagination, was not the first resort. Laws restricted its use. It had to be authorized by the inquisitors and sometimes a physician. Only when evidence seemed strong but insufficient to secure a confession would torture be considered. Approved methods included the garrucha, where the victim's arms were tied behind their back and they were lifted by a rope, sometimes with weights attached to their feet, the rack which stretched the body, and the toca, a form of water torture in which cloth was placed in the mouth and water poured to create a sensation of drowning. These sessions were limited in time, often a quarter of an hour, and could not be repeated unless new evidence emerged. Torture was used in a small percentage of cases, perhaps around 2%. The tribunal kept detailed notes during these sessions, and confessions extracted were cross-checked with other evidence. Medical examination before torture was an unusual requirement for the period. A physician or surgeon assessed whether the accused could endure the procedure without dying. Those deemed physically frail, pregnant women, the elderly, and individuals labeled as mentally unstable were sometimes exempted. This practice reflected the tribunal's concern with legality and procedure. They sought confessions, but not at the cost of killing a suspect before a verdict. The presence of a physician introduced a clinical aspect to the process, blurring the lines between judicial punishment and early notions of medical ethics. If the accused confessed and repented, the tribunal prescribed a penance. Penances ranged from praying certain prayers to undertaking pilgrimages. A more visible form of penance was the requirement to wear a penitential garment called a sanbenito. This sleeveless tunic was marked with symbols indicating the nature of the offense. It might be decorated with red saltires or images of flames and devils. The sanbenito signaled to the community that the wearer had been judged for heresy and was performing penance. In some cases, the garment was hung in the parish church even after the person's death as a lasting reminder. Other penalties included fines, confiscation of property, temporary exile, or being sent to serve as an oarsman on a galley. Public flogging could be ordered. In rare cases, the tribunal banned the convicted from certain professions or barred them from carrying weapons or wearing jewelry. These restrictions could extend to their descendants. Pilgrimages assigned as penance could involve long journeys to shrines such as Santiago de Compostela. The penitent would travel on foot, often in rough conditions, and rely on charity for food and shelter. Along the way, they might meet other pilgrims and share stories. This experience was meant to be both physically taxing and spiritually cleansing. It removed the person from their community, giving them time to reflect on their actions and to show humility. Upon their return, they would resume their lives, hopefully having learned what inquisitors considered proper orthodoxy. When a case reached its conclusion, sentences were pronounced in a ceremony called the auto da fe, meaning act of faith. These events were designed to reaffirm community values and demonstrate the power of the Church. They were usually held in a public square or large plaza, often on Sundays or feast days. Bells would toll early in the morning and a procession formed. The green cross, a symbol of the tribunal, led the procession. Clergy, civil authorities, and the condemned walked in order. Spectators gathered, some out of curiosity, others from obligation. The ceremony included a mass, sermons, and the reading of each sentence. Those who had repented wore their sanbenitos and were reconciled through prayers and penances. Unrepentant heretics were handed over to secular authorities for execution. The inquisitors themselves could not impose the death penalty. Burning at the stake was the prescribed civil punishment for unrepentant heresy. In practice, many condemned were first strangled before the fire was lit. The ceremony was long and solemn, a mixture of ritual, theater, and warning. We can imagine a typical auto da fe in vivid detail. It might take place on a warm spring morning in a city like Seville. By dawn, citizens gather in the plaza, secure spots on balconies, and bring their children. Vendors sell roasted chestnuts and cups of water. The air buzzes with anticipation. Officials set up a raised platform for the civil authorities and the Inquisition's dignitaries. The green cross is draped with white cloth. A line of people wearing penitent robes emerges from a side street. Some keep their eyes on the ground, lips moving in prayer. Others glance nervously at the crowd. The sermon, delivered by a Dominican friar, emphasizes the importance of purity and obedience. The list of offenses is read slowly. As each name is announced, family members in the crowd may gasp or weep. When a sentence of reconciliation is pronounced, there is relief. When someone is handed over for execution, a murmur runs through the crowd. After the sentences, the procession moves toward the place of punishment. Those condemned ascend platforms. If they have refused to recant, they are bound to stakes. A priest offers a crucifix for a last chance to repent. Some kiss it, receiving the garrote to spare them the flames. Others refuse, and the executioner lights the pyre. Smoke rises into the sky. The crowd watches in silence. The spectacle serves as both deterrent and reinforcement of communal norms. The first auto da fe in Spain occurred in Seville in 1481, soon after the establishment of the tribunal. Over time, these ceremonies became more elaborate. By the 17th century, they could last an entire day and included formal seating for dignitaries, canopies for the royal family, and stage settings. Painters later depicted such scenes, emphasizing the grandeur and the emotions of the participants. The last public auto da fe in Spain took place at the end of the 17th century. After that, ceremonies continued, but were less theatrical and sometimes held behind closed doors. In the New World, however, public autos persisted longer, with recorded events in Mexico City into the 18th century. The early years of the tribunal under Torquemada were marked by severity. Thousands of conversos were investigated, and many were executed. Historical estimates suggest that around 2,000 people may have been burned at the stake in the initial decades. The number of prosecutions was far higher, and many more faced lesser penalties. Over time, the intensity of prosecution declined. By the mid-16th century, death sentences were rare. The institution's focus shifted toward other offenses, such as blasphemy, bigamy, unlawful moral conduct, and certain mystical movements. The tribunal also took an interest in censorship, reviewing books for doctrinal errors and controlling the circulation of ideas. One group targeted in the early 16th century was the Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity. After the conquest of Granada, the crown issued edicts requiring Muslims to convert or leave. Many converted, but like the conversos, they were suspected of practicing their former religion in secret. Trials of Moriscos occurred, though the severity varied by region. In some areas, authorities were more lenient, recognizing the challenge of sudden conversion. In others, tribunals pursued Moriscos more aggressively. Over time, policies hardened, culminating in expulsions. By 1609, the crown expelled many Moriscos from Spain, disrupting communities and economies. The Inquisition was one instrument among several used to enforce these changes. The cultural world of the Moriscos was rich and varied. They spoke Arabic, or a Romance dialect called aljamiado. Their homes contained ornate ceramics and textiles with geometric patterns. They cultivated olive groves and irrigated fields. They baked bread in communal ovens and cooked dishes with saffron and cumin. Their music featured stringed instruments and drums. For many Moriscos, conversion was a pragmatic choice to avoid exile. They continued to whisper prayers in Arabic under their breath and to celebrate certain festivals in private. When the tribunal investigated, it relied on informants to detect these practices. Sometimes entire villages were forced to prove their adherence to Catholic rituals by reciting prayers in Spanish and attending Mass. The trauma of these investigations and the eventual expulsions still resonate in the memory of Spanish history. The tribunal also pursued Christians accused of embracing Protestant ideas. In the 16th century, especially after the rise of Lutheranism and Calvinism in Northern Europe, the Catholic Church became alert to any signs of Protestant influence. Spain had relatively few Protestants, but those accused faced long trials and imprisonment. The tribunal sought to root out imported books and clandestine study groups. At the same time, the institution monitored movements like the Alumbrados, or Illuminated Ones, a mystical group that emphasized inner light and direct experience of the divine. Some inquisitors saw these practices as dangerous deviations from orthodox teaching. Individuals accused of witchcraft appeared before the tribunals as well, but the Spanish authorities were generally skeptical of witchcraft accusations compared to other European courts. They viewed many accusations as superstition and required substantial proof before convicting someone of witchcraft. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was engaged in wars across Europe and the Mediterranean. Resources were stretched, and the monarchy relied on silver from the Americas to fund its armies. In this context, the tribunal's role in maintaining internal unity was seen as crucial. The Crown feared that Protestantism, if unchecked, could undermine the social order and weaken royal authority. Thus, the Holy Office became part of a broader strategy of control. Its vigilance over religious conformity was tied to concerns about loyalty and stability. Meanwhile, scholars and artists continued to thrive within the boundaries of orthodoxy. The mystic poet St. John of the Cross wrote about the dark night of the soul, and the painter El Greco produced haunting works that blended Byzantine and Western styles. The coexistence of creative expression and strict oversight reveals the complexity of this period. The Inquisition's influence reached across the ocean. In 1570, a tribunal was established in Mexico City, followed by others in Lima and Cartagena. In these colonies, the tribunal dealt with a mix of Spanish settlers, indigenous peoples, Africans, and people of mixed ancestry. Cases included accusations of practicing Judaism or Islam, local syncretic practices blending indigenous and Catholic traditions, and crimes like blasphemy. The colonial tribunals mirrored the organizational structure of those in Spain, complete with edicts, trials, and auto da fe. They also generated extensive records, which today provide historians with insights into daily life in the colonies. In Lima, the tribunal investigated cases involving the Andean region. Indigenous religious practices were often labeled as idolatry. In one notable case, a man named Francisco de Aguirre, who held the position of chief of a village, was accused of allowing local rituals that blended Catholic and traditional Andean elements. The tribunal considered whether this was ignorance or deliberate heresy. Witnesses testified about offerings placed on mountains and dances performed during Christian feast days. The inquisitors, unfamiliar with Andean cosmology, sometimes misunderstood symbolic gestures. Punishments could include public penance, fines, or exile. In other cases, African slaves in Cartagena were accused of preserving Islamic practices brought from West Africa. These cases highlight the cultural complexity of the colonies and the challenges faced by an institution attempting to impose uniform religious norms across continents. Finance was an important aspect of the institution. Confiscation of property provided revenue, especially in the early years when many wealthy conversos were targeted. However, the Inquisition was not a simple money-making enterprise. Running tribunals was costly. Staff salaries, prison upkeep, and the expenses of auto da fe added up. Records from later centuries show that tribunals often struggled financially, despite income from fines and confiscations. Funds came from church benefices allocated to the Holy Office, and at times from royal grants. In the New World, tribunals sometimes invested revenues in real estate to secure a steady income. Financial documents reveal lists of purchased food, medicine, and even tobacco for prisoners. Such mundane details remind us that behind the grand narratives were everyday transactions and human needs. In the 17th century, the Holy Office faced criticism not only from external enemies, but also from within Spanish society. Some members of the nobility and clergy questioned the fairness of the trials and the economic burdens imposed on families. Others were concerned that the institution tarnished Spain's reputation abroad, affecting trade and diplomacy. These criticisms gathered momentum as Enlightenment ideas spread. Philosophers emphasized reason, individual conscience, and tolerance. Though Spain was somewhat insulated from the early waves of the Enlightenment due to censorship and geographic distance from Northern Europe, ideas circulated among the educated. Translations of works by Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot were clandestinely shared. Some noblemen obtained special licenses to import foreign books. The pressure to reform or abolish the tribunal grew gradually. An intriguing aspect of the tribunal's history is its unexpected contribution to the development of modern psychiatry. In the 18th century, inquisitors were confronted with defendants whose actions suggested mental illness rather than heresy. They grappled with questions about intent. Was a person who uttered blasphemous statements in a state of delusion guilty of sin? Could someone with hallucinations be held responsible for making heretical claims? To resolve these questions, inquisitors started consulting physicians. Cases were meticulously documented, and medical observations were used to determine accountability. This collaboration helped shape early ideas about mental illness and criminal responsibility. Scholars have noted that the tribunal became a surprising space where medical and legal notions of madness intersected. This development occurred not because inquisitors were enlightened humanists, but because they needed to discern whether a soul could be saved or should be punished. In seeking rational explanations, they inadvertently advanced medical understanding. One such case involved a man in Mexico City who was known to walk through the streets shouting blasphemous phrases and drawing strange images. His neighbors denounced him. When examined, he showed signs of erratic thought. The inquisitors called in physicians who diagnosed him as mad. Instead of imposing a death sentence, they sent him to a hospital where he received care. The case stretched on for years as the tribunal monitored his condition. In their records, inquisitors debated whether his utterances should be considered heresy. This case demonstrates the intersection of medicine, religion, and law in the colonial context. It reveals that even in an institution known for punishment, there were moments when mercy and scientific curiosity prevailed. The Inquisition's methods and impact left deep marks on communities. Fear of denunciation eroded trust. People became careful about what they said and with whom they associated. Family gatherings, markets, and religious observances were shadowed by the possibility that a friend or relative might one day inform on them. The record of 67,521 trials that still exists shows the geographic reach of the tribunal. Researchers have found that regions with intense inquisitorial activity still exhibit lower levels of economic output and educational attainment centuries later. These areas also report lower levels of social trust. The scars of persecution, economic disruption, and enforced conformity linger long after the last trial was held. In some areas, higher levels of church attendance persist, possibly reflecting how religious institutions filled the social space left by suppression of other forms of communal life. In quantifying these long-term effects, economists examined municipal data and compared regions with varying intensity of inquisitorial activity. They found that municipalities without recorded trials or with low levels of persecution have higher median incomes today. The difference amounts to several hundred euros per person annually. They also noted that trust indicators measured through surveys asking if people believe most others can be trusted were lower in regions with a history of strong inquisitorial presence. Another aspect studied was educational attainment. Areas with high inquisitorial activity had a lower proportion of adults with university degrees. This pattern was linked to the tribunal's suspicion of literate and educated individuals during its operations. The suppression of intellectual curiosity created a cultural climate that discouraged higher education for generations. Yet the black legend that emerged around the tribunal, fed by political propaganda from rival nations, exaggerated some aspects and ignored others. Protestant writers in the 16th and 17th centuries depicted the Inquisition as uniquely barbaric. This served political purposes during conflicts between Spain and other European powers. Pamphlets circulated claiming millions died under the Holy Office, which was far from the reality. Modern scholarship estimates that total executions across all tribunals in Spain and its colonies over 3 centuries numbered in the low thousands. In comparison, witch hunts in other parts of Europe claimed tens of thousands of lives. Recognizing this difference does not excuse the suffering inflicted by the tribunal, but it places it in a broader context. It reminds us to be cautious about accepting exaggerated narratives that serve ideological ends. The term Black Legend refers to the overall negative portrayal of Spain that took hold in Northern Europe. Beyond the Holy Office, this legend painted the Spanish as cruel, fanatical, and backward. It arose from political and religious conflicts during the Reformation and the Dutch Revolt. Dutch pamphleteers and English authors used tales of the Inquisition to rally support against Spanish rule. They depicted inquisitors as monsters, created lurid engravings of torture scenes, and circulated stories of secret dungeons. These images were powerful propaganda. They also influenced later views of Spain, including in the 19th century, when Romantic writers like Edgar Allan Poe set stories against the backdrop of inquisitorial torture. The persistence of the Black Legend demonstrates how historical narratives can be shaped and distorted for political purposes. The decline of the Spanish Inquisition was gradual. During the War of the Spanish Succession and the Bourbon Reforms, royal authority over the institution increased. In 1808, when Napoleon invaded Spain and installed Joseph Bonaparte as king, the tribunal was suppressed. When Ferdinand VII returned to the throne, he reinstated it, but the world had changed. Liberal revolutions in Europe promoted constitutional government and individual rights. In Spain, debates over the role of the Church and the state intensified. In 1812, the Cortes of Cádiz approved a constitution that limited the Inquisition. After various periods of suppression and restoration, the institution was definitively abolished in 1834. The last execution by the tribunal took place in 1826, when a schoolmaster named Cayetano Ripoll was hanged and burned for alleged deism in Valencia. By then, the institution was a shadow of its former self, out of step with the political and intellectual currents of the time. In the years after abolition, the archives of the Holy Office were gradually transferred to state custody. Scholars began to study them, revealing the inner workings of the tribunal and challenging myths. Historians found that the meticulous records included not only trials and punishments, but also routine correspondence, financial statements, and letters from citizens appealing for justice. These documents illuminated everyday life in early modern Spain and its key colonies. They showed how ordinary people interacted with the state, how communities functioned under scrutiny, and how laws were interpreted and implemented. The archives became a rich resource for understanding social history. As we reflect on this long history, we might imagine walking through the remains of an old tribunal's headquarters. The walls are thick and cool to the touch. Stairs lead up to rooms where inquisitors once met to discuss cases. The air carries the faint scent of old wood and stone. Dust motes float in shafts of light from high windows. Papers once piled high on desks have long been stored in archives, but the echoes of voices remain. In the jail, narrow cells with small openings for light hint at the solitude prisoners endured. In the chapel, a painted cross still hangs, reminding us of the religious framework that gave the tribunal its legitimacy. Each space invites contemplation. What stories unfolded here? Who wept? Who found courage? Who despaired? These silent questions linger like whispers. Imagine also the village outside. People go about their daily tasks, drawing water from the well, baking bread, tending sheep. Children chase each other through narrow lanes. The church bells ring the Angelus. In the distance, hills rise, dotted with olive trees. The rhythm of life continues, even when institutions impose fear. Festivals were still celebrated, marriages still took place, and families still shared meals. Yet the presence of the tribunal cast a shadow. A sermon might remind parishioners of the latest edict. A neighbor might suddenly disappear. Life was a mix of ordinary joys and silent anxieties. Our narrative can linger on a winter evening when a family sits around a hearth. The fire crackles. A grandfather tells stories of saints and miracles. Outside, the wind whispers through the streets. The children listen, eyes wide. They have heard rumors about secret trials and punishments, but such topics are not openly discussed. Instead, they focus on the warmth of the fire and the comfort of familiar voices. In the distance, perhaps, an official walks past on patrol. His footsteps echo, then fade. The village returns to its quiet rhythm. In moments like this, we feel the resilience of ordinary people who lived under the weight of extraordinary institutions. We can also picture the interior of a library where scholars copy texts. Illuminated manuscripts lie open on heavy tables. Candles flicker, casting a warm glow. Outside, censors from the tribunal might arrive to inspect which volumes are permitted. Lists of prohibited books were updated regularly. Works by Enlightenment thinkers, novels, and scientific treatises were scrutinized. The censors, though part of the institution, sometimes had to decide whether to allow a work for its educational value or ban it for fear of subversion. The tension between knowledge and orthodoxy played out silently in rooms filled with ink and parchment. This tension slowed the flow of ideas but could not stop it entirely. Across the Atlantic, in the streets of Mexico City, a different scene unfolds. Indigenous women sell fruits and flowers in the market. African slaves unload goods from carriages. Spanish bureaucrats discuss the latest decree. The tribunal's building stands near the cathedral, reminding all that even in this bustling colonial capital, the Holy Office is watching. Trials here involve people of diverse backgrounds. An indigenous person might be accused of mixing Catholic prayers with ancestral rites. A settler might be questioned for possessing a prohibited book. The complex tapestry of colonial society meant that the tribunal had to navigate many cultural worlds. The record books show the voices of priests, merchants, artisans, and farmers. Each case reveals a fragment of life in a world where cultures collided and blended. Sometimes the tribunal intervened in interpersonal conflicts that had little to do with doctrine. A jealous husband accused his wife of practicing magic. A neighbor claimed that another's success in business could only be due to a pact with spirits. The inquisitors heard these complaints and tried to discern whether any actual heresy was involved. In doing so, they became arbiters of community tensions. Their decisions shaped reputations and livelihoods. The fact that people brought such cases to the tribunal suggests that it was seen, at least at times, as a court of last resort for grievances that other institutions could not resolve. This role complicated the image of the tribunal as merely punitive. The physical symbols associated with the tribunal were potent. The green cross used in processions, the San Benito worn by penitents, and the capirote, a tall conical hat decorated with images of flames or devils, created a visual vocabulary of sin and redemption. These garments humiliated the wearer, yet they also allowed for reintegration into the community after penance. People could see that the individual had been judged and was on a path of correction. In a time when public reputation was vital, these symbols carried powerful messages. Another enduring feature of the tribunal was its meticulous record-keeping. Scribes documented testimony word for word. They recorded the names of witnesses, the questions asked, and the answers given. They noted the time and place of each session. Even the tone of voice or a pause might be captured. In some cases, drawings of torture instruments were included in the records. These archives provide historians with a window into the everyday speech, fears, and hopes of people from centuries past. Without such records, much of this world would be lost. Ironically, an institution meant to suppress dissent left behind an unparalleled archive of personal stories. As time went on, some people exploited the tribunal's procedures to their advantage. It is recorded that prisoners in ordinary jails sometimes blasphemed intentionally so that they could be transferred to inquisitorial prisons, which were cleaner and offered better rations. They would confess and perform penance, then return to their lives. This phenomenon shows how the institution's reputation for order could attract those seeking to escape harsher conditions elsewhere. It also illustrates the complexities of social control. An organization created to punish heresy ended up providing a refuge, albeit temporary, for some of society's marginalized members. Blood purity statutes known as limpieza de sangre played a significant role in the social history of the Iberian Peninsula. These statutes required proof that one's ancestors were free of Jewish or Muslim heritage for several generations in order to qualify for certain positions, such as membership in religious orders or municipal offices. The tribunal did not invent these statutes, but it enforced them indirectly by investigating cases where someone claimed false ancestry. This system entrenched social divisions and fostered resentment. Over time, debates arose about whether such measures were theologically justified. Some argued that baptism should erase previous identities, making distinctions based on ancestry unchristian. Others, influenced by older prejudices, maintained that bloodline mattered. These debates continued until the statutes were gradually relaxed and then abolished. The tribunal also exercised censorship. The Index of Prohibited Books listed titles that Catholics were not permitted to read. The goal was to protect believers from errors of doctrine and morality. Works by theologians who challenged church teaching, novels with amorous content, and scientific writings perceived as contradicting Scripture could end up on the list. Ownership of such books could lead to investigation. Yet intellectual curiosity often found ways around these restrictions. People hid prohibited books behind false panels or imported them secretly. Some authors wrote with deliberate ambiguity to avoid censors. The tension between censorship and curiosity is a recurring theme in the history of knowledge. The tribunal's efforts to control reading slowed the dissemination of new ideas, but could not stop them entirely. In some respects, the tribunal operated like other courts of its time. Many European legal systems in the early modern period allowed for torture, secret witnesses, and trials without defense counsel. Confiscation of property and public humiliation were common punishments. The Holy Office was part of a broader judicial culture that valued confession and public penance. Comparing the tribunal to other contemporary institutions helps us understand both its distinctive features and the general practices of the era. It was neither uniquely cruel nor uniquely benign. It reflected its time, with all the moral and legal complexities that entails. When we consider the people who staffed the tribunal, we find a range of motivations. Some inquisitors were zealous defenders of orthodoxy. Others were cautious jurists concerned with procedure. Some took pride in the meticulous nature of their work, believing that they were protecting souls. A few may have enjoyed the power the institution afforded them. Others perhaps felt trapped by the responsibilities of their office. It is easy to judge these individuals from a modern perspective, but it is more challenging to understand the beliefs and pressures that shape their actions. Human motivations are rarely simple. The tribunal's reach into daily life extended to family relationships. In some cases, parents denounced their children or children denounced their parents. Such acts have been interpreted as evidence of the institution's capacity to break familial bonds. However, the motivations were varied. Some denounced loved ones to save them, believing that a light penance was better than eternal damnation. Others were coerced or misled. Still others acted out of anger or rivalry. These stories reveal the emotional complexity of life under scrutiny. They remind us that people are capable of both cruelty and compassion in the same environment. Over the centuries, the Holy Office became a topic of satire and critique. Writers and dramatists used humor and exaggeration to comment on its practices. In the 17th century, Spanish playwrights like Tirso de Molina and Calderón de la Barca incorporated inquisitorial themes into their works, sometimes portraying inquisitors as bumbling or overzealous. In the 18th century, Enlightenment writers across Europe mocked the institution as backward. In the modern era, popular culture references, like the British comedy group Monty Python's sketch about the Inquisition, play on the contrast between the historical seriousness of the institution and the absurdity of expecting it in everyday life. These cultural products shape public perception as much as scholarly work. Artistic depictions of the Inquisition often focus on the drama of the auto da fe. Paintings by Francisco Rizzi and other artists capture the solemnity and spectacle of these events. A notable work shows the 1680 auto da fe in Madrid, with the Plaza Mayor filled with onlookers, the condemned wearing their penitent robes, and officials seated beneath canopies. The detailed rendering of faces conveys a range of emotions: fear, resignation, curiosity. Another artist, Francisco de Goya, critiqued the institution in his series of etchings titled Caprichos. One plate depicts hooded figures seated in judgment, suggesting the arbitrariness of authority. Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Pit and the Pendulum, draws inspiration from the fear associated with inquisitorial torture, though it takes creative liberties. Such works contribute to the myth and memory of the tribunal, influencing how later generations imagine its world. The physical spaces associated with the tribunal changed over time. Some buildings were demolished, repurposed, or preserved as museums. In Spain, several former inquisitorial headquarters now house archives or government offices. Visitors can walk through halls where trials were once conducted. Guides explain the history with a mix of solemnity and curiosity. In Mexico City, the Palace of the Inquisition now contains a medical school. The transformation of these spaces from courts of religious enforcement to places of education symbolizes shifts in values and priorities. Stone walls that once heard confessions of fear and penance now witness lectures about anatomy and pharmacology. As we near the end of our long exploration, it is helpful to pause and breathe. Think of the many lives touched by this institution, those who suffered, those who enforced, and those who watched from the sidelines. Each was part of a complex web of faith, power, and human emotion. The echoes of the tribunal remind us of the importance of justice, transparency, and respect for individual conscience. We also see how institutions can outlive their original purpose, becoming relics that nevertheless influence future generations. The title of this video, The Cruel World of the Spanish Inquisition, might suggest relentless horror. Reality is more nuanced. Cruelty existed, but so did bureaucracy, piety, opportunism, fear, and unexpected gestures of care. The world of the tribunal was intricate. It was rooted in a belief system that viewed religious unity as essential to social order. It was shaped by political goals and economic incentives. It evolved over time, reflecting changes in society. When we examine it with patient attention, we see both the darkness and the ordinary human struggles within it. Our story winds down with the abolition of the tribunal and the slow fading of its presence. In 1834, decrees officially ended the institution, and its archives were absorbed into state collections. People breathed easier, conversations became freer. New ideas circulated with fewer obstacles. Yet memories lingered. Grandparents told children about the time when even a whispered criticism could lead to questioning. Writers and historians kept the stories alive, some with accuracy, others with exaggeration. The shadow cast by the Holy Office did not vanish overnight. It became part of the cultural memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of combining absolute religious authority with state power. Tonight, as you listen to this narrative, imagine yourself standing outside one of those old buildings as evening falls. The sun dips below the horizon and the sky deepens to blue. You feel the stones beneath your feet cooling with the night. The air is still. Through an open window, you hear a faint hymn, perhaps sung by a choir practicing in what is now a church. The notes drift into the evening, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. The building that once housed the tribunal is quiet, its heavy doors closed. You reflect on the centuries of stories contained within its walls. The people who lived through those times are gone, but their experiences remain in the collective memory. The long arc of the Spanish Inquisition teaches us that institutions, however powerful, are products of their time. They arise from particular fears and goals. They can endure for centuries, adapt, and eventually fade. The human spirit persists through and beyond them. In listening to such histories, we honor the memories of those who suffered and those who persevered. We also remind ourselves of the importance of compassion, critical thought, and vigilance in the face of institutions that claim absolute authority. Let your breathing slow as the last words settle. The story you have heard is heavy with history, but it is told in a gentle rhythm to ease you toward rest. The quiet of the night surrounds you. Shadows lengthen, and the stars begin to appear. In the distance, a bell tolls the hour. You let go of the images of tribunals and trials and instead focus on the simple fact that, across centuries, people have always sought peace. You are part of that long search for tranquility and understanding. Good night. In the centuries before the tribunal, the Iberian Peninsula was a crossroads of civilizations. Islamic rule in Al-Andalus brought advanced irrigation, astronomy, and poetry. The court at Córdoba attracted philosophers and musicians from as far as Baghdad. Christian monks learned Greek philosophy through Arabic translations. Jewish scholars like Maimonides wrote in Arabic and Hebrew, blending traditions. Markets thrived, and cities were vibrant centers of trade. Religious minorities paid special taxes, but often enjoyed relative autonomy. This golden age was fragile, dependent on rulers' tolerance and political stability. Over time, shifting alliances and external pressures eroded coexistence, leading to conflict. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Architecture from this period reflected the fusion of styles. Mosques featured horseshoe arches and intricate calligraphy, while churches adopted Islamic motifs. The Alhambra in Granada, with its serene courtyards and reflective pools, embodied the heights of artistic expression. In Toledo, the Synagogue of Santa Maria la Blanca, built by Muslim architects for Jewish worship, later converted into a church, stands as a testament to the interwoven histories. Such buildings carry the memory of communities that built them, reminding us that art can endure beyond political change. Festivals mark the passing of seasons, with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Language also tells a story of exchange. Castilian Spanish incorporated words of Arabic origin: algebra, azúcar, and almohada. Hebrew terms entered everyday speech through commerce and scholarship. Muslim poets wrote in classical Arabic as well as in colloquial dialects. People switched languages depending on context, speaking Romance languages in markets, Arabic at court, and Hebrew or Latin in religious settings. This linguistic diversity fostered creativity and humor, but also occasional misunderstandings. Linguistic boundaries did not align perfectly with religious boundaries, creating hybrid identities. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Intellectual life flourished in translation schools. At the School of Translators in Toledo, scholars of different faiths collaborated to render Greek and Arabic texts into Latin and Castilian. They translated works by Aristotle, Avicenna, and Ptolemy. Through these efforts, knowledge of mathematics, medicine, and philosophy flowed into Europe, influencing universities in Paris and Bologna. The translation movement was a sign of mutual respect among learned people. It demonstrates that even when tensions existed, cooperation was possible in the pursuit of wisdom. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. The violence of 1391 did not arise out of nowhere. Economic hardship, political instability, and religious zeal combined to spark attacks on Jewish quarters. Preachers stirred crowds with fiery sermons blaming Jews for natural disasters and social problems. Mobs plundered homes, destroyed synagogues, and forced conversions. Those who survived faced a painful choice: leave their homeland or become new Christians. Many chose conversion, hoping to protect their families. Even then, suspicion never fully disappeared. The forced nature of their conversions planted seeds of doubt among old Christians. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Conversos navigated complex social terrain. As new Christians, they were theoretically equal to old Christians, but in practice they faced discrimination. Some laws barred them from certain guilds and offices. They were often accused of being insincere, especially if they continued to observe dietary laws, light candles on Friday nights, or avoid work on certain days. Families were divided as some embraced Catholicism wholeheartedly, while others clung to hidden practices. Over time, intermarriage between conversos and old Christians blurred distinctions, but genealogical records were scrutinized for generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Genealogical investigation became an obsession in early modern Spain. People seeking positions in the church or government had to prove purity of blood. This process involved collecting baptismal certificates and interviewing neighbors about family histories. Notaries drew up lengthy reports tracing ancestry. In some cases, rivals would plant rumors about a competitor's lineage to block their advancement. This system created anxiety and fostered a culture of secrecy. Families hid information about distant relatives or arranged marriages to improve their social standing. The tribunal's focus on conversos reinforced this environment of surveillance and mistrust. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Tomás de Torquemada was born into a family of converso ancestry. Despite this background, he championed policies against those with similar heritage. As a Dominican monk, he cultivated a reputation for asceticism and discipline. His appointment as confessor to Queen Isabella gave him significant influence over the royal conscience. He believed that Spain's unity and strength depended on religious uniformity. His zeal and organizational skills turned the tribunal into a formidable force. He presided over meetings where policies were set, and he traveled to tribunals to ensure compliance. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. The 28 articles promulgated under Torquemada covered a wide range of offenses. They listed not only heresy, but also crimes like bigamy, adultery, usury, and possession of forbidden books. The articles allowed the tribunal to prosecute cases that involved moral and social regulation as well as doctrinal purity. They reflected a worldview in which personal behavior was inseparable from religious faith. Under these rules, individuals could be investigated for actions that today might seem purely private. This expansion of jurisdiction increased the Holy Office's reach. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Torquemada's role in the expulsion of Jews remains a subject of debate. He argued that the presence of Jews hindered the conversion of conversos by providing a living example of Jewish life. The Edict of Expulsion gave Jews 4 months to convert or leave. Estimates of how many left vary, but tens of thousands departed. They took with them skills, knowledge, and cultural contributions. Some found refuge in Portugal, North Africa, or the Ottoman Empire. Others faced hardships in their new homes. The expulsion reshaped Spanish society, leaving certain industries short of skilled workers and altering demographic patterns. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Edicts of grace often began with a solemn proclamation by an inquisitor or local priest. They explained that the tribunal sought to save souls, not simply to punish. They described various heresies, secret circumcision, avoidance of pork, reciting psalms in Hebrew or Arabic, and consulting fortune-tellers. People listening might recognize practices from their own households. The edict invited them to come forward quietly, confess, and receive penances. Those who did could preserve anonymity, protecting their social standing. The grace period created a temporary space where self-accusation was encouraged. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Over time, however, tribunal officials concluded that grace periods were ineffective in uncovering hidden heresies. Edicts of faith replaced them. These documents were longer and more detailed. They described signs of heresy, such as washing hands before meals in a specific way, changing sheets on certain days, or refusing to eat certain foods. They also listed heterodox beliefs, denying the divinity of Christ, rejecting the sacraments, or reading banned books. The edicts of faith were read annually and posted for all to see. Their thoroughness conveyed the message that nothing escaped the tribunal's notice. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. The announcement of an edict sometimes required the entire town to gather. Attendance was mandatory in some places, especially in colonies where authorities wanted to ensure obedience. Officials kept lists of those present. Fines or penances could be imposed on those who did not attend. This practice turned the reading of an edict into a tool for social control. By making the announcement a civic event, authorities reinforced the idea that religious conformity was a shared responsibility. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. The content of the edicts reveals the tribunal's concerns and priorities. They targeted practices that blurred the boundaries between religions. For instance, lighting candles on Friday evenings, a Jewish ritual, was prohibited. So was reciting certain prayers in Arabic, which signaled Islamic identity. Carrying amulets with Hebrew inscriptions, keeping meat separate from milk, or bathing on specific days could all be interpreted as signs of non-Christian practice. The edicts also condemned beliefs associated with mystical movements, such as claims of visions or direct communication with God without clerical mediation. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. The shift from grace to faith edicts also reflects changing attitudes within the tribunal. Early officials hoped to encourage voluntary repentance. Later officials aimed to create comprehensive surveillance. The long lists of prohibited actions created a culture of suspicion where everyday behaviors were scrutinized. People learned to conform outwardly, sometimes adopting new habits to avoid suspicion. The shift also indicates the tribunal's growing bureaucratic approach. Classification, documentation, and standardization became central to its work. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. The trial process began with an investigation phase. After receiving a denunciation, the fiscal prosecutor gathered testimonies from witnesses. These testimonies were secret, and the accused did not know the identity of their accusers. Witnesses were asked to swear that they had no enmity against the person. They described incidents, often in great detail, about behaviors they considered heretical. The prosecutor collected these testimonies and decided whether to proceed. If the evidence seemed weak, the case might be dropped. If it seemed strong, a formal arrest followed. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Once arrested, the accused was taken to a secret prison. They were informed that they were being accused of heresy, but were not told the specific charges. They were asked to swear an oath to tell the truth. The inquisitors then invited them to confess to any heresies they might have committed. If they confessed immediately, they could receive a lighter sentence. If they denied wrongdoing, the inquisitors presented the general accusations, practicing Judaism, Islam, or Protestantism, blasphemy, or other crimes. The accused was given time to respond. They could request that certain individuals' testimonies be disregarded if they could demonstrate enmity. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. The next phase was the publication of charges. The inquisitors read aloud the specific allegations without revealing who had made them. The accused was asked to respond to each one. They could provide explanations or denials. They could also propose witnesses in their defense. The tribunal would then call these witnesses, who testified under oath. The defense testimony was added to the record. Despite the possibility of defense, the imbalance of information and power made it difficult for the accused to prevail. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. After the defense phase, the inquisitors retired to consult with theologians and jurists in a meeting called the Consulta de Fe. They reviewed the evidence, witness testimony, and the accused's statements. They deliberated on the strength of the case and the appropriate sentence. Possible outcomes ranged from acquittal to suspension of the case, to penance, to reconciliation, or to relaxation to the secular arm for execution. Acquittals were rare. Suspensions allowed the accused to go free, but the case could be reopened later. Reconciliation required public penance. Relaxation to the secular arm was reserved for those considered stubborn or relapsed heretics. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Throughout this process, the role of the notary was crucial. Notaries wrote down every question and answer. They recorded the tone and demeanor of the accused. They noted pauses, tears, and gestures. These records were sent to the Suprema for review. The precision of the documentation aimed to create an unimpeachable record. This obsession with documentation was part of the tribunal's bureaucratic culture. It allowed for future review and protected inquisitors against accusations of wrongdoing. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Torture methods sanctioned by the tribunal were codified in manuals. The rack, or potro, stretched the body by pulling limbs in opposite directions. While the device was common in secular courts, inquisitors were instructed to avoid causing lasting harm. They sought to induce confession through discomfort rather than permanent injury. Physicians were present to monitor the victim's condition. They could call a halt if they believed the person was at risk of dying. This oversight was meant to legitimize the use of torture within legal and moral boundaries. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. The garrucha involved suspending the accused by the wrists, tied behind their back, and then lifting them off the ground. Weights could be added to their feet. The sudden drop and strain caused intense pain in the shoulders. Inquisitors watched carefully, asking questions during the process. The spectacle of the person hanging in midair served to intimidate. Again, strict time limits were observed. The accused had opportunities to confess or to insist on their innocence. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Water torture, or the toca, consisted of placing a cloth in the person's mouth and pouring water over it to create a sensation of drowning. This method required careful control. Inquisitors poured water slowly, allowing the person to breathe briefly between pours. They asked questions during these intervals. The psychological terror of suffocation often led to confessions. Modern observers recognize this as a precursor to the technique known today as waterboarding. It was used sparingly. Records indicate that the tribunal believed that repeated sessions could corrupt the reliability of confessions, so they limited its use. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. The San Benito came in different forms depending on the severity of the crime and the status of the penitent. The basic version was a yellow tunic with red crosses, worn by those who had confessed and repented. A more elaborate version, known as the Samara, featured images of demons and flames, signifying that the person had been condemned to die but had repented before execution. The most severe, called Fuego Revolto, showed flames pointed downward, indicating that the person had recanted too late and would be strangled before burning. These garments communicated messages to onlookers about the wearer's fate. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Besides wearing the San Benito, some penitents were sentenced to a term of exile. Exile could mean leaving the town for a specific period or moving to a different region. For merchants, exile disrupted business networks. For farmers, it meant leaving their land unattended. The punishment thus had economic consequences beyond personal shame. Exiles sometimes returned after fulfilling their penance, but they carried the stigma of their past with them. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Service as a galley oarsman was another punishment. Convicted men might be sent to work on royal galleys, rowing heavy ships for long hours. This work was physically demanding and dangerous. Galleys engaged in naval warfare and piracy, and oarsmen faced the risk of attack, disease, and harsh discipline. Serving on a galley separated men from their families and communities. For the state, using convicts as oarsmen provided manpower without paying sailors. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Confiscation of property was both a punishment and a financial strategy. It served as a deterrent and replenished the tribunal's treasury. Property seized from wealthy individuals included houses, vineyards, and livestock. Lists of confiscated goods were posted publicly, signaling that heresy had material costs. Families who lost property often struggled to recover economically. Some relocated, while others appealed to the Suprema for partial restitution. Occasionally, after a person was reconciled, some property was returned. The process of confiscation and restitution created a complex administrative paper trail. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Early autos da fe were solemn and relatively simple. They occurred near churches and included a mass, a reading of sentences, and the handover of unrepentant heretics to civil authorities. As the ceremony evolved, it became more elaborate, especially in major cities like Valladolid and Madrid. Temporary stages were built. Tapestries decorated the balconies. Musicians played processional music. Royal officials attended in ceremonial dress. The presence of the monarch signaled that religious and secular authority were united. The ceremony was both a religious ritual and a demonstration of state power. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. In the New World, auto da fe incorporated local elements. In Mexico City, indigenous musicians played flutes and drums during processions. People of African descent participated as spectators and sometimes as penitents. The diversity of participants reflected the colonial population. One of the most famous auto da fe in Mexico occurred in 1596, involving members of the Carvajal family. They were crypto-Jews who had settled in the colony. The public execution of several family members shocked the local community and signaled that the reach of the Holy Office extended across the ocean. travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Auto da fe ceremonies often had a carnival-like atmosphere despite their grim content. Vendors sold food, children laughed, and travelers from surrounding villages came to witness. For some, it was the only time they saw the king or heard official speeches. Sermons delivered during the ceremony were long and moralizing. They framed the events as a lesson about the dangers of heresy. The blending of public entertainment and punishment raises questions about human fascination with spectacle. The auto da fe served as both a warning and a communal gathering. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. In addition to conversos and Moriscos, the tribunal investigated those accused of Lutheranism and other Protestant beliefs. The arrival of Protestant books and ideas through merchants, diplomats, or students returning from Northern Europe worried the authorities. In some cases, possession of a vernacular Bible was enough to raise suspicion. Trials of suspected Protestants were relatively few compared to those of conversos and Moriscos, but they were often harsh. Individuals like Rodrigo de Valer, a merchant from Seville, faced imprisonment and confiscation for spreading Lutheran ideas. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Bigamy was another offense prosecuted by the tribunal. Men, and occasionally women, who married again without legal dissolution of a previous marriage could be tried. This was not strictly a religious crime, but the church considered marriage sacred. Bigamy cases reveal personal dramas: sailors who remarried believing their spouses had died, or men who maintained households in different towns. Penalties included flogging, exile, and service in galleys. These cases show how the tribunal acted as a moral arbiter in matters of family life. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. The Alumbrados were a mystical movement that emerged in Castile in the early 16th century. They believed that true spiritual enlightenment came from direct experience of God rather than through church rituals. Their meetings involved meditative practices and visions. Authorities saw their teachings as dangerous because they bypassed clerical authority and encouraged individual interpretation of Scripture. Several Alumbrado leaders were tried, including Francisca Hernandez, whose visions and ecstatic behaviors attracted followers. The tribunal sentenced some to imprisonment and penance, seeking to suppress what it saw as spiritual disorder. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches, inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Accusations of witchcraft appeared in the records, but Spain did not experience witch hunts on the scale of Germany or Scotland. Inquisitors often dismissed witchcraft accusations as superstition. They required concrete evidence of maleficium, harm caused by spells, before proceeding. In one famous case in the Basque region in 1609, thousands of people were accused of witchcraft. A special investigation led by Alonso de Salazar Frias concluded that there was little basis for the charges. He recommended skepticism toward witchcraft accusations, and many suspects were released. This cautious approach contrasts with more zealous witch trials elsewhere. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. The Carvajal family provides a notable example of crypto-Judaism in colonial Mexico. Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva, governor of the Nuevo León region, was himself a convert and brought relatives to the New World. His nephew, also named Luis, secretly maintained Jewish practices. He and his family observed the Sabbath, followed dietary laws, and prayed in Hebrew. Their activities eventually drew attention. In 1596, after a prolonged trial, several family members were executed. Their fate was a stark warning to others who might consider practicing forbidden religions in the colonies. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. In Peru, the tribunal encountered indigenous rituals that blended Catholic and pre-Columbian elements. Andean people honored mountain deities, or apus, while attending Mass. They carried small bundles of coca leaves and chicha, a fermented corn drink, as offerings. Missionaries sometimes tolerated these practices as a way of attracting converts. The tribunal, however, periodically investigated and punished what it considered idolatry. The conflict between syncretism and orthodoxy shaped the Idar religious landscape of the Andes and remains a subject of scholarly interest. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. In Cartagena, in present-day Colombia, the tribunal focused on African religions brought by enslaved people from the Gold Coast and Congo regions. Enslaved communities preserved elements of Islam and animist beliefs. They organized clandestine ceremonies, prayed in Arabic, and recited verses from the Quran. Accusations of Islam often arose from overseers seeking to assert control. Trials involved language barriers and cultural misunderstandings. Some defendants were acquitted after explaining that certain practices had social rather than religious significance. Others received penances or exile. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. The presence of the Holy Office in the New World also intersected with issues of race and status. Indigenous and African defendants were sometimes treated differently from Spanish settlers. Their testimonies were viewed through the lens of perceived cultural inferiority. The tribunal's approach could be paternalistic, imposing lighter sentences on those deemed ignorant. However, this paternalism masked a hierarchy that privileged European norms. The archives reveal complex interactions among people of different ethnicities and legal statuses, illustrating the layered nature of colonial society. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Detailed account books show that the tribunal's finances were a constant concern. The cost of maintaining staff, feeding prisoners, and staging ceremonies could exceed revenues. In some years, the tribunal operated at a deficit, relying on loans from wealthy benefactors or the crown. Lists of expenses include payments for candles, ink, paper, uniforms, and repairs to buildings. Even the cost of rope for executions and fabric for sanbenitos was recorded. These mundane entries humanize the institution, reminding us that behind every grand historical narrative are ledgers and budgets. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. When property was confiscated, it had to be inventoried, stored, and sold. Auctions were organized to convert seized goods into cash. These sales attracted buyers from the community who purchased furniture, clothing, jewelry, and livestock. The process created economic opportunities for some while devastating others. The tribunal sometimes invested proceeds in real estate or lent money to local governments. Financial officers managed these investments, seeking to secure a steady income. Mismanagement or corruption occasionally occurred, leading to inquiries by higher authorities. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Mental illness was poorly understood in early modern Spain and its colonies. People exhibiting unusual behavior could be viewed with suspicion. They might be accused of possession, heresy, or witchcraft. The tribunal's need to determine intent led it to consult physicians. These physicians drew on Galenic humoral theory, diagnosing imbalances of black bile, phlegm, or blood. Treatments included bleeding, purging, and herbal remedies. In some cases, the tribunal ordered that a defendant be confined to a hospital rather than executed. This decision reflected an evolving understanding of culpability and mercy. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars studying inquisitorial records have found fascinating examples of early forensic psychiatry. One defendant claimed to have visions of angels commanding him to criticize the church. The inquisitors asked physicians to evaluate his mental state. After examining him, they concluded that he suffered from melancholia, a condition associated with depression and hallucinations. They recommended confinement in a hospital. Their report included observations about his mood, sleep, and appetite. This case illustrates how the tribunal inadvertently documented symptoms and diagnoses that resemble modern psychiatric assessments. It challenges the notion that all inquisitors were indifferent to individual circumstances. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. The economic impact of inquisitorial persecution rippled through generations. Families that lost property struggled to rebuild wealth. Merchants forced to leave took their networks and capital with them. Regions that experienced intense persecution lost skilled artisans and administrators. Over time, these economic losses compounded. Municipalities with high inquisitorial activity today show lower levels of economic output compared to areas with less activity. Modern researchers use satellite imagery to measure nighttime light as a proxy for economic activity, finding correlations with historical persecution. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Education suffered as well. In regions where inquisitors targeted literate people and confiscated books, a culture of caution developed. Parents discouraged their children from pursuing higher education. Schools were subject to censorship, limiting the circulation of scientific and philosophical works. Universities remained under ecclesiastical control. Generations grew up with less access to diverse ideas. When modern public education systems emerged in the 19th century, these regions lagged behind in literacy and academic achievement. The legacy of suspicion toward intellectualism persisted. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Trust within communities eroded under the constant threat of denunciation. People learned to keep opinions to themselves. They avoided political discussions and refrained from expressing doubts about doctrine. This caution became ingrained, shaping social norms. Surveys conducted in recent decades show lower levels of interpersonal trust in areas with a history of inquisitorial presence. Trust affects cooperation, civic engagement, and economic development. The lingering mistrust illustrates how institutions can shape cultural attitudes long after they disappear. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. The Black Legend was not created in a single pamphlet, but emerged over decades. Early contributions came from writers like Reginaldus Gonzalez Montanus, a pseudonym for a converso who fled Spain and wrote a scathing account of the tribunal. His book, published in the mid-16th century, included stories of cruelty and injustice. It was translated into several languages and reprinted across Europe. Protestants used it to portray the Catholic Church and the Spanish monarchy as oppressive. The book's vivid imagery influenced public perception for centuries. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Later, during the Dutch Revolt, propagandists in the Netherlands produced engravings and poems depicting Spanish soldiers and inquisitors as bloodthirsty villains. These works served a political purpose, to rally support for the rebellion and to justify seeking allies against Spain. English writers joined in, especially during the rivalry between England and Spain in the late 16th century. They portrayed Spain as a land of tyrants, contrasting it with the supposed freedom of their own countries. The narrative simplified complex realities into stark good versus evil. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Modern historians have sought to correct the exaggerations of the Black legend without minimizing the suffering caused by the tribunal. Scholars like Henry Kamen have analyzed archival records to provide a more balanced view. They emphasize the relatively low number of executions compared to other European persecutions, the bureaucratic nature of the tribunal, and the ways political rivals used exaggerated stories for their own ends. Revisionist scholarship encourages us to consider context and nuance rather than accepting propagandistic narratives. It reminds us that historical memory is constructed and contested. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. The 18th century brought new ideas to Spain through diplomatic exchanges, travel, and clandestine literature. The Bourbon monarchs, influenced by French models of governance, implemented reforms aimed at centralizing authority and modernizing administration. They reduced the power of traditional institutions like the Inquisition. Charles III, for example, expelled the Jesuits and reformed universities. The monarchy saw the Holy Office as archaic and an obstacle to progress. While it did not abolish the tribunal immediately, it curtailed its functions and encouraged more secular courts. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. As Enlightenment ideas spread, there was a growing emphasis on rationality and empirical evidence. Writers like Benito Jerónimo Feijoo argued for tolerance and criticized superstition. Newspapers circulated essays on science, philosophy, and the arts. Secret societies and salons provided spaces for discussion. The tribunal struggled to control the flow of information. It banned certain books, but the demand for forbidden texts increased. Smugglers and librarians created networks to circulate works by Voltaire, Rousseau, and Kant. The battle between censorship and curiosity intensified. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. The French Revolution shocked Spain. The execution of a king and queen, the rise of republican ideals, and the anti-clerical violence in France alarmed Spanish authorities. The tribunal responded by increasing censorship and punishing those who possessed revolutionary literature. Yet the appeal of liberty and equality resonated with some Spaniards. Revolutionary songs and slogans reached Spanish ears. Intellectuals debated whether reforms could be achieved without violence. The tension between reformers and conservatives defined the political landscape of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Napoleon's invasion in 1808 disrupted the old order. Joseph Bonaparte, installed as king, abolished the tribunal. When Ferdinand VII regained the throne, he reinstated it, but by then its authority was weakened. The Cortes of Cádiz, meeting in exile, drafted a liberal constitution in 1812 that limited the tribunal's power. The institution was suspended, restored, and suspended again. These cycles reflected the broader struggle between absolute monarchy and constitutionalism. By 1834, the tribunal was finally abolished, marking the end of a long chapter in Spanish history. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. While the tribunal operated, daily life went on. Farmers planted wheat, barley, and vines according to the seasons. Shepherds led flocks to summer pastures. Fishermen cast nets into rivers and seas. Women spun wool, cooked stews of chickpeas and vegetables, and baked bread in communal ovens. Children played games with pebbles and dolls made of cloth. These mundane activities provided continuity amid the disruptions of inquisitorial investigations. The rhythm of agriculture and the cycle of religious festivals anchored communities. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Clothing reflected social status and regional identity. Wealthy individuals wore silk and velvet, trimmed with fur or embroidery. Their garments featured rich colors like deep red and indigo. Poorer people wore wool and linen in natural hues. Moriscos favored tunics and flowing garments influenced by Islamic fashion, while conversos often adopted styles that signaled conformity. Head coverings varied, wide-brimmed hats, veils, or hoods. Footwear ranged from leather boots to woven sandals. The choices people made about clothing could signal allegiance, identity, or attempts to avoid scrutiny. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Stone walls of towns kept out marauders, but also contained gardens where herbs and citrus trees grew, perfuming the lanes. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Food customs also carried meaning. Old Christian families feasted on pork, a symbol of Christian identity. Moriscos and conversos sometimes adopted pork dishes publicly to deflect suspicion. Dishes like cocido, a stew with chickpeas, vegetables, and various meats, became staples. Sweets flavored with almonds, and honey reflected Moorish influence. Wine flowed at festivals, while olive oil, garlic, and herbs flavored everyday meals. Regional variations were rich: seafood in coastal areas, cured meats in mountain villages, and rice dishes in Valencia. Dining together was an important social activity. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Songs and stories were part of the oral culture. Ballads recounted heroic deeds of knights and saints. Lullabies soothed children, while work songs helped coordinate labor in fields and workshops. Storytellers recited legends of El Cid, romances of chivalry, and tales from the Arabian Nights. These narratives often contained moral lessons and subtly commented on current events. They provided entertainment and a sense of continuity with the past. In the evenings, communities gathered to sing and share stories, finding comfort in shared creativity despite external pressures. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. Consider the way music filled public squares, from simple drums and flutes to complex stringed instruments borrowed from many cultures. Scholars met in courtyards to discuss philosophy and medicine, sharing knowledge across language barriers. In reflecting on the tribunal, we are reminded that history is not simply a list of events, but a tapestry of human experiences. It contains moments of cruelty and compassion, ignorance and learning. Institutions like the Holy Office were shaped by the fears and ambitions of their time. They attracted individuals who believed they were serving a higher purpose, as well as those who sought power. Their actions had consequences that rippled across centuries. Understanding this complexity encourages empathy and caution when evaluating past and present institutions. Fishermen returned from rivers and coasts with baskets of fish that would be salted, smoked, or eaten fresh. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Daily life included tasks like grinding grain at communal mills, drawing water from wells, and weaving cloth on wooden looms. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. The memory of the tribunal remains a warning. It shows how state and religious power combined can suppress dissent and create cultures of fear. It also demonstrates that even oppressive institutions can inadvertently contribute to knowledge, as seen in the early development of psychiatry. The long-term economic, social, and psychological effects of persecution remind us that decisions made in one generation can echo for many. In studying the tribunal's history, we gain insight into how societies negotiate faith, power, and the human need for meaning. Travelers arrived from distant regions, bringing news and rumors that connected villages to a wider world. Night markets offered dates, figs, and roasted meats, while storytellers recited epics to crowds under the stars. Architectural styles merged arches inspired by Islamic art with Romanesque solidity, creating unique cityscapes. At twilight, families gathered around lamps of olive oil, telling stories passed down through generations. Festivals marked the passing of seasons with dances that blended Christian and older customs, showing cultural layering.